Hi everyone, it's Alicia, and today's video is going to be a little trip down memory lane. I did something really interesting last night on a whim. I went back and watched the very first video that I made on my first YouTube channel. The original YouTube channel that I created way back in 2008 was called Theta Raven. That was the YouTube name I came up with. And the very first video that I made was talking about the origins of what was at the time my most serious work. And that was both a novel and a stage play version of my take on the classic story, The Phantom of the Opera. I had titled the story Erik, that's Erik with a K, E-R-I-K. That is the name of the man who later becomes known as the Phantom of the Opera. And gosh, looking back on that video, so many mixed emotions. Well, first of all, it was interesting to see that in that video I pretty much looked the same, even though that video was made 11 years ago, so I was 19 years old at the time. But what struck me most about the video is the level of confidence I clearly showed when I was discussing my work. I just sat and talked to the camera like I was talking to a friend, and it was a much more flowing stream of consciousness. Whereas now when I make a video, sometimes I'll stop and think about what I'm gonna say next. But with that video, it just all flowed out, because at the time, well, I'm sure many of you have been in this place when you're young, you're working on your first serious work that you intend to send out to the world, and you have the utmost confidence in it. You think this is the greatest thing in the world, it's going to take the world by storm, and I'm going to take over the world with my literary creative brilliance. Thank you very much. And that's what I showed in the video, and it made me really, not sad, but just kind of look at myself and go, wow, have I become that jaded already in only 11 years? Because I'm gonna be 31 in April, and yet I've already started to have the attitude of the old writer who's been writing for 40 years and is more inside their head to their own detriment than they were when they were younger. When I was writing Erik, again, I thought it was the greatest thing ever, and that nobody had ever thought of an idea like this before, which they hadn't, and I'll get to that in a minute. Nobody had ever thought of an idea like this before. This was going to take the world by storm. People were going to see a new depth to the story that had never been shown in any other previous version, including the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. As much as I love that, it's not the greatest or the most in-depth look at the original story, which can be found in the book by Gaston Leroux. I just thought my work was the greatest thing ever, and that, yeah, I was going to take over the world with it. And the story of Erik, originally it began as telling the lineage of the story of Phantom of the Opera. So it began with the book by Gaston Leroux and then worked its way through the various film versions, because while watching all those film versions and studying the story, it struck me that the story of Phantom was told every decade or so, and it always seemed to come up at a time when the world needed it, when something was going on in the world that was reflected in the story. So for instance, the Lon Chaney film was done in the 20s, which was a time of opulence in America and jazz and just freedoms in ways that hadn't been seen in the world before. It was after World War I. Women were emerging into their own. They had just gotten the right to vote. The country was looking at how to deal with shell shock, which today would be known as PTSD, how to deal with soldiers who had come home disfigured and traumatized from the war, and the Great Depression would hit in a few years. Those sorts of things that brought up questions that hadn't really seemed to have been asked before in the world's history, because World War I was the most bloody and catastrophic war that the world had ever seen at that time. It was literally known as the war to end wars at the time. People thought it would be the last war in history. It was so brutal. And then years later, the next film version was done in the 1940s with Claude Rains, which was done when World War II was raging at the time, and all the implications of that the Nazis had of cleansing anyone that wasn't like them, whether physically killing people or trying to kill ideas that didn't jive with theirs. So there was that going on. And then, of course, the next film version was done in the 60s with Herbert Lom, which the 60s was the decade of hippies and moving into a greater consciousness. And then the next one was Phantom of the Paradise in the 70s, which was absolutely amazing. It wasn't set in the time of the story of Phantom of the Opera. It was a contemporary piece. And if you haven't seen it, because it's one of the lesser known versions of Phantom, check it out. It's amazing. It's basically, if you took Phantom of the Opera, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Faust, and a sprinkling of Poe references and The Picture of Dorian Gray, and then told it in a campy 70s film that pointed to hypocrisies and the commercialization of the 70s music scene at the time. That's what Phantom of the Paradise is. It's amazing. I mean, come on, it's got Paul Williams as a devil-worshipping record producer. What more could you ask for? Which is funny, because when I first saw the film, I didn't know who Paul Williams was, and I was like, oh, he played the part really well. It was really creepy and suited the role perfectly. This guy is a really good, sinister actor. And then when I looked him up, it's like, oh, he wrote all these happy songs that are about love and peace and stuff, and he's pretty much the exact opposite of what his character is in the film. So hats off to you, sir. So basically, at its conception, Erik went through the timeline of Phantom and threaded all the versions together to say, hey, this story isn't just a fluffy, melodramatic love triangle. It obviously has important things to say, given all the times it's popped up in history and when it's come up in history. And as the writing of the script went on, and I went through draft after draft, the story changed to tell my take on the life of Erik himself, the character, because the story of Phantom takes place when he's in his middle-aged years. His age isn't exactly said in the book, but people have speculated he's anywhere from his late 40s to early 60s. So he's had an entire lifetime of experiences and things that have shaped him to be who he is, and yet so many versions of the story just boil his life down to, oh, he went through this sappy love triangle and then he was redeemed at the end. And it's like, no, there seems to be more to his character than that. Not that his experience with Christine and Raoul wasn't important. It obviously had a huge impact on him, but there was more to this man than just the melodramatic story that had been built up around him for so many years, and that's the version I wanted to tell. Now, looking back, are there flaws with my version? Absolutely. I pretty much Disney-fied the character because it was really hard for me when I was younger to come to terms with this character is so sympathetic and empathetic, and I relate to him so much as a person with a disability, as a person who's gone through the hardships of living in a world that wasn't built around my body and doesn't understand the hardships of that. And yet Erik killed people, he blackmailed people, he did a bunch of things that, no matter how tragic his backstory is, there's no excuse for them. And it was really hard for me to come to terms with that cognitive dissonance, and so I pretty much, like I said, Disney-fied the character. I wrote the story so the various murders and blackmails and all the malevolent things weren't his doing. They were accidents or other circumstances that got pinned on him. And I mean, I suppose that could be an interesting angle to go with, because in the book it's never directly said Erik killed these people or did these things. It's just these things happened, and the theater management and staff and the people who performed there all blamed it on the opera ghost. So it could be an interesting take, but it doesn't seem quite honest to the dark side of Erik, and Erik definitely does have a dark side. So would I incorporate that if and when I tackle the story again? Absolutely. But do I still stand by the fact that to me the Phantom of the Opera is more a story that's a cautionary tale to society about what happens when a child inherits society's emotional baggage? 110%. That to me is what the story is, as opposed to the focus being strictly on the love triangle. And what struck me in that original video, and I will leave a link in the description below so you can see baby Alicia and what she was like at the time. What struck me most about that video was the confidence I had, and the fact that, yeah, I thought my version was the best thing ever, and it was going to take over the world. And I realized that I need that confidence again, because I queried the book, the novel version. I tried to get the stage play off the ground, and it had a few staged readings, which is where actors read the script aloud so the playwright can hear how it sounds, sometimes before, sometimes in front of an audience, sometimes with just the playwright. But in Erik's case, it never got past just me and the actors hearing the script out loud. It never got in front of an audience. And it was a good learning curve for me, because it showed just how tough the industry was. Again, I was 19 years old. I had graduated high school the year before. I was going to go off to college. I was basically the bright, starry-eyed artist who may have a vague idea of, oh sure, the industry's hard, but not in the sense of I've experienced that yet. And so it was a real learning curve for me to show just how tough the industry can be. And I was ready to face that, but with rejection after rejection, and no matter how much I revised the story, there was still rejection. And yeah, I guess I did get a little jaded, where it was like, fine, what the hell do you want from me? I don't know what else to do. The story's as polished as I can make it. And I feel like I'm in that place again with my play adaptation of The Man Who Laughs, where I have it as perfect as I can get it. And I feel it is perfect now. Because this play I've been working on for 10 years, if not more so. I wrote the first draft of it in a single week when I was on spring break my senior year of high school. So I've put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into that version. So being at that crossroads again, it's made me a little worried, because it's hard when you feel like you have this great artistic work that is going to change the world and bring love and light and joy and happiness to the world, and introduce it to a story it's never heard before. And yet all these other versions stand in the way, and it seems like you wrote this really deep, awesome adaptation, and yet things that are much more shallow get greenlit and get produced. In the case of The Man Who Laughs, the 2012 film is just awful. It's horrible, and I plan to do a whole video on that, because I could rant for hours about just what a disgusting disgrace that version is to the original Victor Hugo book. But yeah, my point is, looking back on that video, I realized I need to boost up my confidence again and to look at all my work and say, hey, this is the best thing ever, and it's going to take the world by storm, and if I put enough blood, sweat, and tears into it, it's going to rock the world. And any other adaptations be damned, you know? This is my unique voice, my take on stories or my original work, and it's gonna rock. And so, yeah, it was quite a humbling wake-up call to watch that original video. So have you had similar experiences, my fellow artists and writers? What have you done when you feel yourself in a confidence slump? And if you watch that original video, please let me know what you think. So yeah, that's my little trip down memory lane, and thanks for coming on it with me, and thank you for watching. Please follow me on all my social media links, which are listed in the description below, and have a great day, happy writing, and blessed be.